I would like to congratulate Civis for doing something which is much more than music to my ears. It's also music to a lot of Indian citizens' ears, I would suppose. Now, when we talk of democracy, we always presume that it's something which we have borrowed from the outside world, and then India is also a grand country. I come from I'm trying to describe myself now, because I've already been introduced as being part of government. So I'll have to be conscious of what and how I speak. Sometimes the activist DNA in me just forgets that I'm part of the government. So I'll try to keep reminding myself. My life trying to understand policy started several decades ago. A young indigenous tribal was killed in the forest of Bandipur. And very quietly, his family was paid a fortune those days, 1,000 rupees. And he was asked to cremate the body. Now, this tribal had a confusing dilemma. Culturally, they would never cremate, they would only bury. And the only way I got to know, I was a young physician, and I'd won over the hearts of the people, because if you're the only doctor around for 100 square miles, you win over hearts of everybody anyway. So it wasn't magic. And he came to me and said, what should I do? I'm confused. It's not about taking the money or how he died. It was about, should I cremate or should I bury? And I started asking a little few questions and said, why are you even wanting to cremate? He said, no, the range forest officer came and told me you should do it before this evening, take 1,000 rupees. So I told him I really can't understand much of this. I was all of 22, freshly out of medical school, and in medical school they don't teach you all this anyway. So I just told him I don't know what to tell you, but maybe you should do what you're culturally what you're accustomed to, and he buried it. The next day when I met him, I asked him, but why did the ranger give you the money? I had forgotten to ask him the previous day. And he said, my son, because his father was talking to me, had gone to the forest to get firewood. And while coming back, he was shot and he died. I said, who shot him? He said, the forest guard shot him. So obviously you get a little angry and pissed off. At 22 you get pissed off if you think something happened to somebody that shouldn't have happened. So, and there was no telephone, there was no electricity, there was no transport where I lived. And so it took me a whole of one day to reach 80 kilometers away, the city of Mysore. And an extraordinary young bureaucrat. And that's what gives me hope. And that's the reason I joined the Capacity Building Commission. Because I do believe there's a lot of embedded capacity in the system, wanting to express itself in its own ways. And this young officer was a DM at that time. In Karnataka, we call them deputy commissioners. He said something to me. He said, this can't be allowed. I really can't understand what it is. If what you're telling is true, I'm going to order an exhumation and a postmortem. And the next day, we had the postmortem done. He had 26 pellets in his back, which means he was shot from the back. And I had no idea of the law. We had no idea of anything. And we lost the case that we had filed, because it was declared as he was fighting, he was actually encroaching into the national park, and therefore the national property was being protected, and the people were within the rights to do what they did. Fast forwarding 20 years later, the same national park area, I woke up to the fact I had sued the government of India and the government of Karnataka for violation of tribal rights, the right to live, in the Human Rights Commission. And my argument was, the national park was called a national park for 20 years without the sanctity of law itself. In 1972, we had the Forest Conservation Act, after which the government of Karnataka notified its intent to form the national park. And everybody went to sleep after that. In 1985, the Gazette notified their intent, 13 years later. But in the interim 13 years, every single tribal living in the Bandipur National Park was thrown out of the forest with no compensation given. I was a physician, I never understood all this. Only reason I got agitated was because people were forcibly removed and relocated without asking them, no consultation. They would come, and I can narrate stories. Elephants fed with country liquor would be left into the tribal colonies, and they'll just go berserk. And tribals had a simple belief: if somebody was unnaturally killed, they would simply vacate the place and move away to some other place. So they would vacate the forest because one of the relatives got killed. That is how the mechanisms were. And so we filed for rights. And I realized it wasn't even notified as a national park. And suddenly, all my activists, environmental activist friends woke up and they sued in the Supreme Court saying that our national parks are not notified, something is going wrong. And then the Supreme Court was very green at that time, not that it is not now. They asked all the chief secretaries to file an affidavit after completing due process of law. And the funny part of law was the law said to notify, to issue the final declaration, you got to do a consultation. You got to ask people to file applications why their land should not be declared a national park. That's when I understood what is a consultation. And we filed 1,000 applications saying my burial ground is there, my usufruct of the forest is there, and everything. We give all evidences. And the law also had said something else. Only people who lived there in the forest at the time of the declaration of intent, the forest settlement officer would only consider those appeals if we could prove that we lived in the forest at that point of time. You know, how do you prove that I lived in 1972 when your father is already dead and gone? And so we had a lot of challenges. All our applications were thrown out. I'm giving you the story to just show that consultations can be consultations. Consultations can be cosmetic tools. But consultations can be something very different, and that's what Civis has shown in the last 10 years. I say this because I remember a very nice academic paper of the 1960s, as old as that, Arnstein's Ladder of Community Participation and Engagement. The first step, Arnstein argues, is tokenism. You can say I'm consulting people. Some of our the environmental impact assessments, the social impact assessments, I've sat through them, some corporates, and they are tokenism. Or you can go to the other extreme of the ladder, the 9th step, where real engagement happens. And to listen to the compeers say more than 1,000% traction of citizens doing it shows that today the law facilitates. And my role today in government is to build systematically the capacity of the state. Most people think state capacity is training, and it's a very limited understanding. Training is an instrument to build capacity, but training is not the only instrument to build capacity. There are a lot of instruments available. And today the Honorable Prime Minister has given a call, and it was real music. Maybe, I think a year ago in one of the melas of employment, he said, citizens are the mantra of my government. Their citizen-centric governance is the very focus of what I do. And I started getting deep into understanding it. And again I realized when I talk to a lot of people in the state, many of them tell me, oh, हमने तो charter लगा दिया वहाँ, citizens charter है, हाँ, हम तो citizen-centric है. So there's a very limited appreciation of what citizen centricity has been, one end of the extreme to other end of the extreme, where some extraordinary officers who, without even recognizing it as citizen-centric work, are doing extraordinary work. So we have this entire spectrum in the state. And to unpack this, I started understanding what does Jan Bhagidari mean. Has any state tried this? Any country tried this? And I can tell you, we should all be proud that we are the only country in the world which has even called it Bhagidari. Most of the time we say citizen-centric development or citizen-focused development or citizen-led development. But nowhere in the world has a state come up and said, I want to be a partner with you. State loves to be a provider. State gets its identity by providing. As citizens also love their identity of being dependent on the state. But the day you say citizen is my partner, you're shifting the focus not just from being a citizen, but being part of the authorizing environment that actually leads the state to perform better. And that's a powerful transition. And my lament as an activist today is that citizens aren't ready. The government is ready, the state is ready. But we, the citizens, somehow love to be dependent, being patronized, and being taken care of. In the name of receiving revenues and welfare and all that we talk about, safety nets are important. I've lived with the poorest of the poor, I know how important it is. But then what we don't understand is we're sacrificing something precious in the journey of holding ourselves accountable. And we always like to hold somebody else accountable to the Indian Constitution. But many times we forget that we are part of the Constitution and we have to begin with ourselves first. And that's the way I would like to look at citizen centricity. So to participate in a partnership state, we need a very evolved citizen. And consultation is a very powerful tool, and especially if you build capacities in the citizens. Sometimes I find when you look at, I've been very familiar with the OECD document. I've had a little role to play in it. It's very nice to make frameworks, but then if frameworks are driven by urban-centric thinking, if frameworks are driven by a STEM economic basis, I think we are losing the narrative. Frameworks have to be driven by the contextual realities we live in. So if your consultations are not culturally appropriate and contextually relevant, it will be tokenism, the first level of the ladder. So we've got to deconstruct instruments. We've got to actually get people to understand why a 13-year lag in notifying something in the Gazette itself gives you the power of law. That failure itself gives you a power of law to negotiate. A lot of things to be done. So my way of looking at it is the first part of the journey, and I think the Right to Information Act is a very powerful instrument we have. I would have loved to have said, I was one of the people who were constantly fighting for it those days. So only regret is we shouldn't even have called it right to information. I think it's a responsibility of the state to provide. It's more a responsibility of the state rather than the right of the citizen to ask for it. That's how I look at it, and so we should keep trying to give as much as we can. And the first step in this journey is, can we have a citizen who is enlightened? Enlightened with information. If you want to really be a partnership, we have to address asymmetries of information first. And can you inform the citizen? Can you inform him in a language he understands? A digital survey is not participation. For most part of India, they are very comfortable watching YouTube on their smartphones, but they are not as comfortable using it to address some of the questions you ask them. So that's the reality of rural India, that at least the India I have lived in. And so if the first step is, can you have an enlightened citizen? Enlightenment is just the first step. Many of us think that is the step, that is participation. Mere enlightenment doesn't work. I always think the second step, which is, can we learn how to engage people? And today we are a set of citizens. I've seen Gram Sabhas, I've seen Ward Sabhas. I think the 73rd, 74th amendments, at least in the context in which I have lived, are basically gatherings to tick a box or to distribute. You say, I'm going to give houses, everybody will come for the Gram Sabha. You say, I want to talk about a new law, the chances are people might not come. So how do you engage citizens? It's a nuanced art, it's a science. We have to use tools today to engage, because only if you engage citizens can you allow them to reflect on the information you fed them and then effectively and meaningfully contribute. Then you're climbing up the ladder a bit. But even that is not enough. Because an engaged citizen and enlightened and engaged citizen will end up as a restless citizen if you can't use that energy for something constructive. And I think the obligation of agencies like Civis and all of us in the civil society space to take them to the next level. If he really has to become an empowered citizen, he has to necessarily learn how to act with that information. So acquire information, reflect on it, process it, make it into an actionable, if you can call the word actionable intelligence, and then act on it. Act in a very constructive way, because it's time for us to understand state is not separate from us. For a long time, I was always on the other side of the fence. As a civil society activist, I always thought state must be taught a lesson. And it's a very sad thing. And the best lesson I learned was of an extraordinary police officer who actually attended to my complaint to the Human Rights Commission, came as a special rapporteur to investigate. He now lives with me in the forest where I live. He was in the Human Rights Commission as a special rapporteur. He was a Chaman Lal. He gave, in one of the meetings, I got a little passionate. He called me out in the lunch break and told me, remember one thing, Balu, I admire your passion, but it's not going to get you very far. It might get your name in your newspapers. But you should remember the state is the only permanent mechanism to address your problem. You should learn how to bend the state, but never break it. I think that's the greatest advice I got. If we don't learn how to work with the state, if we don't get to understand this partnership means synergistic partnership with every player in the game, every stakeholder, that's the only way to win. Many times we NGOs think we can supplant the state itself. I think that was my, thankfully, very short-term thinking in the past. At best, we can supplement the state. And therefore, we should all be instruments of change by learning to work together rather than working against each other. So I think finally to end, we must compliment the state that it wants to share agency and control with citizens. And if you look at the PCLP guidelines, etc., they are so powerful. But how many of us citizens even know about it? How many of us are able to educate them? How many of us are able to meaningfully engage with them? And to me, when the national education policy was getting drafted and the process was going on, I was very actively engaged with Dr. Kasturirangan, trying to get the tribal narrative into it. You should have seen the millions of people who responded and the energy with which the team analyzed it, the seriousness with which the state took it. And to me, the real joy was maybe just 1 million people did it. Doesn't matter. We can always come look at this dark cloud and say we are 1.4 billion, only 1 million people did it. Or we can learn to look at the silver lining and say, in a country where hardly anybody participates, 1 million people did it. And the seriousness with which they developed algorithms to vet it, to clean it up, to look at the repetitions and to see how they can use it for the national education policy. And today, I would say post-independent India, as a policy analyst, I would say one of the policies which comes closest to being a citizen's policy would be that throw the politics away, just look at the content, the problem from, and hopefully this will be the norm rather than the exception. So thank you again for inviting me, and it's a privilege to say that so many organizations are getting awards for